Hi, it's Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made this cute little kids bedroom in the attic. I'm going to show you it step by step so you can see all the processes to create this by hand and from scratch. This tutorial is going to be the last one of this series, so at the end of the video I'm going to give you a little update about the channel, but in the meantime, enjoy the tutorial. To create this miniature set, I've started with the technical drawing, sketching one of the wall, for example with the round window, defining the width, the height, the eave, and the different components in that scene. I've also done the sketch for the other wall, defining the position of about everything, the dimension of the window, the number of beam needed as well. Then I took some plywood, 9mm thick, and I cut some pieces for each wall. I've cut the windows out with the jigsaw. Then for the eaves, I cut my plywood at an angle. Now I have a lovely plunge saw with a guide rail. If you don't have one of those fancy tools, but you have a jigsaw, look underneath. You can adjust the plates to cut at an angle as well. That means you're still able to achieve this cut at 45 degrees, which is needed for the eaves with a simple jigsaw. There you have it, the two pieces that I've cut for the eaves. Now for the floor of my set, I've reused an old base. It's composed of a piece of plywood 12mm thick and some studs all around it. I've used a nail gun to attach the board to the studs. That means my platform is raised because it's for stop motion animation and I need to be able to reach underneath the boards for the screws underneath the feet of my puppets. Then I start lining up my wall against the board, use a drill to drill into the stud and use a screw to make sure it's attached firmly to the stud, but I can still remove them whenever I need. And I keep building up, adding more walls on either side. As you can see, each wall is held with at least 2 screws that are removable whenever I want. I've also added some screws to connect each wall to each other and make sure they line up correctly. For the roof, I've cut a nice piece of plywood and make sure it was the nice size to connect with the eave underneath. I've added some super glue to make sure it holds in place while I grab my nail gun and then attach it firmly. Then I took the 2 pieces of plywood that I've cut at an angle and super glued them in position. Make sure you create a line beforehand so you know exactly where your board needs to be glued. So there you have it. I have my 2 pieces in position. Now I have a big hole that I need to fill. To do that, I cut a piece of card or paper, put them in place, mark up exactly the edges of it, cut the piece of paper, copy it onto a piece of plywood, cut it with the jigsaw and then adjust it until it's a nice fit. As you can see, it's a nice snug fit into it and hold it with a super glue. Then I kept building up, taking more pieces of balsa wood, mark up each edges and cut them to size, super glue them in position, add another piece in front of it, mark it and cut it as well. Then I can start sanding all the edges together. When you come to the gap, I just mix up some wood filler, fill them in, let it set and then sand it down. Then I start working on the window. First I cut some pieces of balsa wood 2mm thick to the right width of the window, cut it to size with a little Japanese saw and then sand it down and super glue it in place. I cut another thicker piece of balsa wood for the seal and I make sure I use the nail file to smooth it up all around and super glue it in place. At that stage I realized for some reason my window wasn't centered anymore, or at least I haven't left the same gap on either sides. So at that stage it's fine, you can just add a piece of balsa wood because all the edges are going to be covered with the trim later on, so no one will see it. Then I took more balsa wood, start marking up all the trim around the window, use my little metal miter box and cut them to the right angle. I made sure to use the nail file to smooth all the edges nicely and then super glue them in place. Then I turn the board around, use a leftover piece of clear plastic, mark it up and cut it to size. So I have a piece of plastic that is bigger than the opening. I've also cut another piece of plywood for the front part of the ceiling. And then I start to work on the other wall which have the round window. Now my apologies for the camera being completely out of focus for some reason. I've cut some lengths of white wobbler, warm it up and start shaping it all around the window. I take my time for it and I like to use the metal ruler, it helps shaping it. Oh gosh, it's so blurry, you cannot see a thing. Anyway, then I can turn the board around, add a piece of clear plastic, mark it, cut it so I have a bigger piece than the opening. And now you can see much better with my camera actually working with a better focus how the window turned out. For the floor I just wanted a carpet, which is kind of easy to do. You just apply some PVA glue, mine is clear but any PVA will do. Apply some thick fabric on top of it. And then I've added a board to make sure that the load will be spread evenly. Add some heavy books over it and let it set overnight. The next day you can remove everything and start to trim the edges. Now I went back to my wall, start applying some white gesso to prime the walls. Usually when the primer is set, you can start seeing some bumps and lumps and problems area, so you can just sand it down, maybe use a bit of more filler if needed before you start painting it. And then you apply 2 coats of acrylic paint throughout. I've also added the different colors on the walls. And then I can start reassembling all my walls with the screws to the base. And now it slowly starts to look like a set. Now for the exposed rafter, I took some piece of basswood and aged it with a screwdriver first to mark some grain, and then I used a wood knife to damage all the edges throughout and to give it more of a realistic look. Then I've applied 2 coats of acrylic paint, and then I've done a quick dirty wash with the diluted darker brown acrylic paint. Then I remove quickly with wet paper towel, and that color will get into the grain that I marked up with the screwdriver earlier, so that will create a nice variation in color. Then I position it onto the eave, cut each side at the right angle so it's a perfect match, and then I can super glue it onto the eave. I need to add more of those exposed beams just above the window with super glue as well. And then I place the top of the ceiling back into position, tape on either side so that it stays there. There's a bit of a gap in between the eaves and the ceiling, and I thought might as well just build up this with more of those little rafters so it just gives a better finish. For the skirting, I took some piece of basswood. The first layer is 1 mm thick, the second layer is 2 mm thick, and I just made sure I round up all the edges with a nail file. Then I super glue together, prime it and paint them. Then I cut them to the right size and super glue them to the wall. Now for the window itself, I position a piece of graphic paper on the opening. Once again, I'm apologizing for the blur of the image. I've done the same thing with the other wall and made a clear pattern for my round window. Then I went outside and applied a clear matte sealer on the whole surface that will protect the paint before I do some washes and dirtying down later on. I went back to the template for my window, mark up exactly how I want the grills to be. Then I took some white plastic, mine is PLA plastic, but any white plastic will do, cut some thin strips out of it, and then start positioning them onto the drawing and cut them to size. Once I had each pieces cut to the right size, I put them on the sides in the right order, then use a piece of parchment paper that I cut to size and tape onto my drawing so it's not moving and going anywhere. Then I reassemble every piece of plastic with super glue on top of the parchment paper so it's not going to stick to the table or the paper, and slowly assemble all my pieces together. Add another very thin strip on the front of the central parts. Then I can remove it from the parchment paper, maybe trim the edges or the extra glue if needed, and then I position it onto a piece of clear plastic. Use a tiny bit of super glue to attach it to the clear plastic. Then bring it back onto the drawing, tape it in place, and then use my favorite 3D paint, PBO Thin Relief, and mark all the grills. And taking my time to do this. I let it dry for at least a few hours, but ideally overnight. For my round window, I decided to cut the template, use a compass and mark a smaller circle inside of it, then use the X-Acto blade to remove it. That gave me a template that I can copy onto a piece of white plastic and cut it out, and then use the thinner strip of white plastic to cut some grills for inside of the window. And then I super glue them to each other on top of the parchment paper as well, so it doesn't stick to the table. Once all the pieces were assembled, then I took my clear plastic and used the tiniest bits of super glue, the smallest drop ever, all around to attach it to the clear plastic. That is to avoid having the reaction of the super glue against the clear plastic, which turned into white stain. Then I start to focus on doing some washes. Most of the time I use the dark brown diluted acrylic paint to do my washes, but there's another color that I use a lot, is this kind of dirty beige, and that is really helpful for working on walls with lighter colors such as this one. So in that case, I just apply it throughout the skirting, for example, and remove it straight away with some wet paper towel. I've done the same with the rafter. I went with the same color all around it, remove the excess, let it dry completely because it goes darker as it dry, and then came back to it an hour later, look at it, and add a few more of the washes, maybe in darker brown in some spot later on. But it's best to let the first wash dry to assess if it needs more or not. Now I come to the furniture. I wanted a childish look, so I work with those chunky wooden dowel for the edges of my bed. And for the mattress itself, I use some leftover packaging material that I cut to size and round the edges with some sanding paper. I wrapped up this mattress with some fabric using the hot glue gun all along and take my time to make sure I have it as tight as possible. Then I super glue it to the base of my bed once it was all painted. For the duvet, I've cut 2 pieces of fabric, placed the good side against each other, and used a sewing machine to attach 3 edges together. I turn it inside out, and inside of it I place a piece of thick fabric left over just to build up some volume. And then the key is aluminium mesh. So I like to use 2 sheets of aluminium mesh, cut it slightly bigger, and then fold the edges. If you have the folded edges, it will be easier to get inside of the piece of fabric. And then I just place everything inside of the little pocket that I've created. All I need to do now is just close the top of it with the sewing machine. That gives me a duvet that is completely shapeable, and I can sculpt anything in it, it will keep that shape. I've done the exact same thing for the curtains, using some aluminum mesh inside of them. That means I can sculpt my fold into it nicely. I built up a few other furniture. I wanted a chunky bedside table to go with the style of the bed. Also built the desk a bit thinner this time with yet more pieces of balsa wood. For the chair, I've started with the drawing because I think if you go for more of an elaborate furniture, it's best to have some decision made early on regarding the design, the proportion of everything, and then start to build up from there with some balsa wood and super glue. I've also made a little bookshelf and some cute little boxes that fit exactly into my bookshelf. Once everything I've done, I use the white gesso to prime everything up. Because if, like me, you've used super glue to attach your pieces, it's likely some super glue will show on top of the wood and it will not absorb the paints the same way that if there wasn't any super glue. So to get a cleaner finish, it's best to prime it first, everything, and then you apply 2 coats of acrylic paint. Now I went back to my wall, reassemble the windows. I use a tiny bit of super glue at the back of the panel to make sure the clear plastic is holding onto the plywood. Turn it around, then went back to my 3D paint, Pebbles and Relief, and went around all the edges to fill the gap. One tip I found really useful is to use some wet Q-tips. That means you can remove the excess and have a really nice clean finish. I let it dry for at least a few hours and then I've done a wash with the same color that I use around the skirting. I applied all around the window, but as well on the glass panel. I removed with a wet paper towel first, most of it, and then I went with the wet Q-tips all around to remove most of it. But that stage is really important to give it more life and make it look more realistic. Then I took my little curtains, made a hole at the top of it, then insert a piece of balsa wood inside of the hole, and then add a little bit of super glue directly onto the fabric so that I can attach it onto the wall. Then I can start dressing up my set. So I start positioning my bed, bedside table, the cushion. Once you put the duvet, it's all about shaping it to make it look realistic. Decided the kind of style you want. If you want to make it look like someone just woke up out of bed. Now when it comes to the lighting, I'm going to start with a pendant. I wanted to experiment a bit, so I decided to play with some clear warbler and some fabric, and I warm up the warbler much more than I usually do, so you can really see that it starts to melt completely, and that's what I wanted because I wanted to bond completely with the fabric, and it worked. I really pressed it into it and make sure it's bonded nicely. Then I took it out when it was still hot and wrap it up around the parchment paper roll actually, and let it there to cool down in the right shape. Once it completely cooled down, I can reopen it, cut all the edges, and then use a tiny bit of super glue to attach the edges together. Then I made a little template, use some flat wire to create a shape all around the bottom of the lampshade so that it fits nicely inside of it. Use a piece of clear plastic that have this protecting layer so it made it looks like it's opaque. Place it at the bottom of it. Super glue those pieces together. I needed to attach the top of the light and hide all the wires. I need to have a little tube of white warbler, so I warm it up and press it around a dowel to shape it and let it cool down completely. To attach the lampshade itself, I decided to go for 2 pieces of flat wire that I super glue at the top with some little opening that is just enough to place my wire and that it will hold by itself. Well, at least that's the plan. cut a bit of white plastic to create a very simple ceiling rose. Then I use 3 meters of micro LEDs, you can find them super easily on Amazon or eBay. Pass all the wire from above. Then I group all of the light together and then pass them in between my flat wire. At that stage I realized the pen line were coming too low and I need to make sure there's a bigger opening so that the wires can come up. This is when I decided to remove everything, drill again, this time a bigger hole. And as you can see, I have more of my wires coming out. That means I can adjust and have a much better height for my lights. Then I can use my little white tube of Worbla, place it around. Then I super glue it to the top disc and I super glue it to the wire as well. So I have a connection, it hides the wire and it basically holds everything together. The other little desk lamp that I've done, I've made it with just bits and bobs. So I had a piece of basswood for the base, then a brass tube, and I wish I waited until I have a rounded one. This is the only one I found that day, so I made it work with it. But I wish I waited to have a rounded one. It will look a bit cuter for a kid's bedroom. For the top part of the lamp, I've warmed up a piece of clear Worbla and shaped it around a piece of basswood. Now you can see what they look like when they are super glued together. I had a clear opening at the bottom part of my lamp so I can insert some micro LEDs up to the top part of the lamp. Then I decided to drill the wall just above the desk so that it could be hidden by some props, for example. And then I can insert it directly onto my lamp. Initially I thought I can keep the top on, but it was just in my way. So I ended up removing it, shaping, I think it was probably 6 or 8 of those micro LEDs, as much as I can fit basically. And then I super glued the top part of the light back in. Because it was clear Worbla with a bit of paint, it needed a few more coats of paint to finish it off later on. Then I've kept dressing up the set, adding more drawings. Some of them I've made them myself, cut them to size, add them with white tack onto the wall or onto the desk, and add lots of little toys here and there. I made some little teddy bear out of fabric. I've also created some cute animals out of Fimo. And if you have some leftover Fimo, it's perfect for this kind of project. So you can just add a few bits and bobs and create a mess. If you look at a kid's bedroom, they're rarely clean. So add more visual mess to it. It will bring it to life. And there you have it. The set is finished. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of it that this is going to be the last one of this series. Because unfortunately, 1 month ago, I had some damage to my optical nerve and the situation hasn't improved and hasn't changed since then. So I've been doing lots of tests and I've done scans and 2 brain MRI, and unfortunately there's no neurologist or doctor who is able to find out what happened, what is the cause of the damage. And if they cannot find the cause, they cannot find how to fix it. So it seems like it's going to be a very long journey I'm not even sure if it's going to ever get better or if it's going to be a lifelong thing, and I'm going to have to make peace with it either way. Now, when it comes to my channel, obviously everything has been on hold, and it's going to be on hold for a bit longer than what I wish, because I have to relearn and compensate for the vision loss. And it's very tricky to do when I have such limited amount of energy, because it's not just the vision loss that is frustrating, it's the fatigue, it's the headache, it's the dizziness, it's everything else. So I have very limited amount of energy every day for a limited amount of task. And that makes things more frustrating when you try to relearn everything. So that means I'm not going to be able, unfortunately, to upload videos and create content for the next few months probably, because I'm forced to take care of my health, and that's just the way it is. Now, in the last 2 years, I've dived deeply into stop motion animation, and I've enjoyed learning so many things along the way. I try to create lots of tutorials and videos that I wish I could have found when I discovered stop motion animation 2 years ago, and I've not been to film school, I've not had professional training in stop motion animation. So I try to create the kind of support and detailed tutorial that could be useful for other people to get in there and get an understanding of how to construct a set that is really adapted to stop motion animation, that is designed just for that, how to make a puppet, how to get the right gears, and how to do just everything on your own, because it's technically possible to make a whole film yourself if that's what you want to. You don't need a whole team for that, and you don't need to go to film school either, so it's feasible. And I think it's really rewarding to be able to create a film. It's a very therapeutic and healing process to actually be able to tell your story and to share emotion through films. So that would be wonderful if you're able to do it. And you never know, you might even win some awards with it. So I hope that my videos are useful and that it gives you inspiration to create something on your own. After 2 years of doing stop motion animation, I've learned a lot, but I also realized I started to go a bit in circle and repeating myself and started to get a bit bored because I was losing the enthusiasm of the beginning of getting into stop motion animation. And artistically, I went to a point that I realized, you know what, I maybe need to take time to decide which direction I want to take artistically. So maybe this whole situation with my eyes is an opportunity. I try to look at it positively. It's an opportunity to step back, take care of myself, and then define where I want to go next. Because I'm always going to create things, and it's always going to be about in crafting, because that's what my whole life is about. But I think maybe I want to step back into something a bit more experimental. I want to play around a little bit, maybe go for something more abstract. So now that's where I am right now. I don't know, in a few months' time. There's a long process to get there because I need to relearn and compensate many things regarding my vision loss in the meantime. But I hope I'm going to be able to, let's say in a few months' time, upload some new projects, share them with you. Hope you will like them. And in the meantime, I hope you take good care of yourself and that you're kind towards yourself. See you. Bye-bye.